The Isle of Pelisse, Part 4. The Battle of the Meadham Road. The Battle of Three-Legged Cross was a bittersweet victory for the Earl of Westwood. He had prevented King Ludwig from advancing further into Westwood and possibly taking the entire earldom. However, the carnage created by the cannonballs of the king's artillery, most notably the devastating casualties inflicted on the Hildemouth Fusiliers, severely constrained the Earl's ability to press home his advantage. In particular, he was reluctantly forced to postpone his plans for the recapture of Woodlands. King Ludwig was also in a state of conflicting emotions. He did not take his defeat upon the battlefield well, and was most disappointed with the lacklustre performance of many of his troops. However, he found significant satisfaction in the thought that, as things stood, he had added Woodlands to his domains. Hoping to cement this gain, and aware of the full extent of the battering that the Earl had just administered to his white-clad soldiery, he sent an envoy to the Earl of Westwood, proposing a cessation of hostilities. He was relieved and delighted when the Earl agreed to this proposal, and a peace treaty was duly drafted and signed, bringing the War of Ophelia's hand to a conclusion. The Earl of Westwood was neither relieved nor delighted to make peace. On the contrary, he was frustrated and melancholy. These emotions crystallised into cold fury when news reached him that not only had King Ludwig proposed to Princess Ophelia, but that she had accepted his proposal and, what was even more galling, that in order to win her hand, the king had made his now soon-to-be queen a gift of the town and territory of Woodlands. And so it was that on a late summer's day, as August faded into September, King Ludwig and Princess Ophelia were married at Meadham Abbey. All the great and good of the Isle of Pelisse were there. The service was performed by His Grace, the Archbishop of Goatsville, whose ecclesiastical province covered the entire island. The Earl of Westwood was in attendance, as was the Grand Duke of the Farlands. Afterwards, the bride and groom paraded through the town in an open-topped carriage drawn by 12 white stallions. Trotting after them was a ceremonial guard, consisting of the most handsome troopers of the Hildemead Hussars. And then a great banquet was held at Meadham Castle, which was attended by all of the wedding guests. The Earl of Westwood did not enjoy the ceremony. He felt humiliated. He had only attended because he was a gentleman of breeding, and to have declined the invitation would have been exceedingly discourteous. But in the smoking room after the banquet, he took the opportunity to have a quiet conversation with Florian the Fair, the Grand Duke of the Farlands. And these two noblemen found that they were in agreement on a number of important points. For instance, they both agreed that the wedding ceremony had been somewhat overextended. They both agreed that the dinner had been excellent. They both agreed that uniting the crown of the lands between the lakes with that of Hildemead significantly upset the balance of power in Pelisse, to their mutual detriment. They both agreed that it would be in their interests to form a military alliance to counter the threat that the newlyweds might seek to further extend their dominions. And they both agreed that such an alliance should not be merely defensive, but should seek to seize the military initiative by striking first. Thus was born the coalition that became known as the Noble Alliance. And so it was that, after a winter of plotting and planning, in the May of the following year, hostile armies began to mass on King Ludwig's frontiers. The Grand Duke Florian the Fair ruled the Far Lands, a wide but sparsely populated realm extending over the eastern portion of the Isle of Pelisse. His capital was at Welkton, a fishing town on the north coast. From Welkton a road headed southeast, skirting the foothills of Lake End Crag, the great mountain that guarded the eastern extremity of the North Lake, before ultimately reaching the settlement of Potter, nestled in a remote valley hemmed by forests and heathered hillsides. South of Potter was Farvale, the third settlement of note in Florian's domain. The distance from Welkton to Potter was nearly 100 miles, and from Potter to Farvale another 75 miles as the crow flew, but over 100 miles by road. From Farvale a road ran westward, past the gaunt peak of Farfell, from which Farvale took its name, to the South Stream, where a bridge carried the road over the river. The South Stream formed the boundary between the Far Lands and the land between the lakes, and on the western bank stood King Ludwig's town of Southbridge. The Far Lands had a long-standing and proud military tradition. The Grand Duke could call upon the services of 2 regiments of line infantry, 3 squadrons of heavy cavalry, 2 companies of riflemen, and a battery of field guns, all smartly attired in blue uniforms, but scattered between the various centres of population in his domain. His plan was first to take Southbridge and then strike at Goatsville, aiming to quickly capture King Ludwig's capital and thus overthrow his regime and end the war. To this end, Florian ordered his troops to assemble between Farvale and Southbridge. However, the distances involved meant that this operation took some time, and once the general outline of Florian's manoeuvres became clear to King Ludwig, he began to concentrate his own forces between Goatsville and Southbridge, ready to counter Florian's attack once it materialised. In the west of Pelisse, matters came to a head more quickly. With the fall of Woodlands, the forces available to the Earl of Westwood were diminished. However, he was able to move quickly. His men marched from their barracks on 13th May, converging on Woodlands. Although the marriage of King Ludwig to Princess Ophelia had, for practical purposes, united their realms, the now Queen Ophelia still took a particular interest in the lands to which she notionally held title, and in the soldiery that was based there. When it had been part of the Earldom of Westwood, Woodlands had been home to both the Woodlands Foresters and the 2nd Squadron of Light Dragoons. Queen Ophelia liked the green uniforms of the Woodlands Foresters, and retained that regiment in her service, in pretty much its previous form, although she did replace some of the officers. However, the red uniforms of the Light Dragoons were displeasing to her, and she considered that she already had sufficient light cavalry in the form of the Hildemede Hussars. She therefore reconstituted what was left of the 2nd Squadron of the Light Dragoons, which had been badly mauled at the Battle of Holzheim, as a squadron of heavy cavalry, which she named the Queen's Dragoon Guards. She clad these horsemen in green uniforms to match those of the Woodlands Foresters, and placed them under the charge of Major Lambton, who had previously been the commanding officer of the Hildemede Hussars. This meant that the Hildemede Hussars required a new commander. Ophelia had been most impressed with the verve and vigour displayed by the 2nd Squadron of the Hildemede Hussars under the leadership of Captain Jocelyn. She therefore promoted the captain to the rank of major, and placed him in command of the entire regiment. Queen Ophelia was at Meadham on 15th May, when news reached her that the armies of the Earl of Westwood had crossed the frontier. She immediately mustered the Hildemead Hussars and the riflemen of the Meadham Guard and marched west. By the 17th, she had reached the bridge over the River Hilda at Holtzheim, where she learned that 2 columns of the Earl's troops were converging upon Woodlands in a perfectly executed pincer movement. Queen Ophelia responded to this news by finding the fastest horses that the Hildemead Hussars could provide and dispatching 2 messengers. The first messenger bore orders for Colonel Thicket, the commander of the Woodlands Foresters and the senior officer in Woodlands, ordering him to vacate the town and, avoiding contact with the Earl's forces, to head toward her position and thus unite the garrison of Woodlands with the army of Meadham. The second messenger bore a personal letter for King Ludwig, informing him that she had the situation in the west under control, but that he would have to deal with any threat from the east, and assuring him of her continued affection. On the 19th of May, the Earl of Westwood triumphantly entered Woodlands. He encountered no opposition. Colonel Thicket had executed his orders faultlessly. The Earl of Westwood did not linger in Woodlands to savour his success. He had learnt the lesson that dallying about was not usually sound military strategy, and immediately marched his combined force to the south-west, heading for the Meadham road. The country was heavily forested, and the paths by which an army could traverse it were few. Thus it was that, when the Earl reached the road on 21st May, he found Queen Ophelia and her army waiting for him. The Earl's army emerged from the forest into a large clearing bisected by the Meadham road. The area was remote. The only sign of human habitation was a single ramshackle cottage standing by the roadside. By this cottage, Queen Ophelia had placed her dragoon guards. To the right of the dragoon guards, the Woodlands Foresters were deployed in line along the road. In front of the Woodlands Foresters were the men of the Meadham Guard, scattered in open order. The 2 squadrons of the Hildemead Hussars were positioned to the right of the infantry, at the point that the road ran back into the trees, under the personal supervision of Queen Ophelia, who was wearing a bright green riding coat and mounted on a great grey horse. The Earl's army was arranged in 4 columns abreast. On the right flank was the Westwood Horse Guards, with the Earl's own regiment of foot to their left. Next to the Earl's own regiment marched the Hildermouth Fusiliers. On the left of the army rode the light dragoons. Seeing the forces of Queen Ophelia arrayed before him, the Earl of Westwood called his troops to a halt and started barking orders. The 2 infantry regiments formed themselves into attack columns, while the cavalry deployed into line, the light dragoons completing this process very briskly, and the Westwood Horse Guards less so. Queen Ophelia ordered the buglers of the Hildemead Hussars to sound the advance. All along the line, the variegated uniforms of the army of Medum moved forward, with the Hildemead Hussars somewhat ahead of the rest, sweeping forward to threaten the left flank of the Hildermouth Fusiliers, which had successfully reformed its ranks and recommenced its forward progress, along with the Earl's own regiment. The light dragoons wheeled to face the Hussars, while on the far flank the Westwood Horse Guards somewhat tardily completed their redeployment into a line formation. While the first squadron of the Hildemead Hussars continued to ride around the flank of the Earl of Westwood's army, the second squadron turned toward the light dragoons and prepared to charge. Major Montmorency of the light dragoons took the old-fashioned view that, in matters of war, as in matters of love, a gentleman should always endeavour to take the lead. He therefore anticipated the Hussars by launching a charge of his own. The two forces of light horse came together, clashing sabres in a brief and evenly balanced engagement, which concluded when Major Montmorency considered that his troopers had adequately exhibited their gallantry and ordered the light dragoons to fall back. This enabled the Hildermouth Fusiliers, who had turned to face the threat on their flank, to fire a well-directed volley into the now disengaged Hussars. The commanding officer of the 2nd Hildermead Hussars was Captain Butterfield. He decided that the best way to stop the Hildermouth Fusiliers shooting at his men was to charge back into melee with the light dragoons. Being a man of action, this thought was no sooner formed than put into effect. The 2nd Hildermead Hussars crashed into the light dragoons. In a controversial passage in his memoirs that relates to this action, Major Montmorency observes that he had assumed he was engaged in sanguinary combat with gentlemen, and that each party would therefore extend to the other the courtesy of an adequate period of recuperation between rounds. As such, he had not anticipated such a precipitate resumption of hostilities, and was caught unprepared by the uncivilised behaviour of Captain Butterfield. This argument is not accepted by advocates for Captain Butterfield, who point out that he was simply adhering to Major Montmorency's own adage that, in matters of war, a gentleman should endeavour to take the lead. Whatever your opinion as to the merit of these opposed arguments, the performance of the light dragoons in the face of this onslaught was lamentable, and the outcome was identical to that at the Battle of Holzheim. The light dragoons were shattered by the impetuous charge of the 2nd Hildermead Hussars. In the meantime, Queen Ophelia had ridden over to her infantry and was urging them forward. The Meadham Guard obeyed her orders with more alacrity than the Woodlands Foresters, with the result that the riflemen advanced into an isolated position well to the front of the line infantry. This did not serve them well when they were charged by the Westward Horse Guards, caught in the open without support, and cut to pieces. The Westward Horse Guards now found themselves menaced by the Queen's Dragoon Guards, who had moved into an ominous position on the Horse Guards' flank. The Horse Guards extricated themselves from this predicament by performing an about-turn and trotting briskly to the rear. The Westward Horse Guards were not the only cavalry to make a strategic withdrawal. Irritated by the continued fire of the Hildermouth Fusiliers, both squadrons of the Hildermead Hussars withdrew to a position well out of musket range. Having seen off the Hildermead Hussars, the men of the Hildermouth Fusiliers pivoted back to their right and recommenced their advance toward the thin green line of the Woodlands Foresters. To the right of the Hildermouth Fusiliers, the Earl's own regiment closed ranks, facing down the Queen's Dragoon Guards. The first squadron of the Hildermead Hussars cantered back into position on the right flank of Queen Ophelia's army. The second squadron of the Hildermead Hussars was still shaken from the volleys of musketry that had been inflicted upon it by the Hildermouth Fusiliers, and remained a safe distance from the centre of the action, the troopers taking the time required to recover their overstrained nerves. And now the drums began to beat time, and the Woodlands Foresters marched steadily forward, bayonets fixed, bearing down inexorably on the two columns of the Earl of Westwood's infantry. The drums fell silent, and the three-deep line of green uniforms halted its advance. Orders were shouted, muskets were levelled and then discharged in a thunderous rolling volley that tore into the red-clad ranks of the Earl's infantry. That first volley was devastating, but not conclusive. The Earl's men were rocked back, but did not break. They had the advantage of numbers and now began to return fire. The battle was in the balance. But now Queen Ophelia threw her dragoon guards into the scale. The ground shook under the pounding hoofs of the heavy horsemen as they slammed into and rode over the massed ranks of the Earl's own regiment, reducing it to bloody chaos. The Earl was dismayed by the destruction of the Earl's own regiment, but he did not despair. He too had heavy cavalry to throw into the fight, and now he did so. Even in the Dragoon Guards' moment of triumph, the Westward Horse Guards charged into their rear. It is to the credit of the Queen's Dragoon Guards that they were not completely overwhelmed by this unexpected onslaught, but managed to maintain their cohesion and extricate themselves from the fray. However, they were forced to withdraw, leaving the Woodlands Foresters without cavalry support, at the mercy of the Westward Horse Guards. But this victory came too late. Even as the Westward Horse Guards wiped down their swords and regathered for the decisive charge, the Woodlands Foresters relentlessly discharged volley after volley into the Hildermouth Fusiliers. The Fusiliers were still formed into a column of attack, trying to push home an assault on the Foresters' line. But the weight of the Foresters' fire repeatedly drove the Fusiliers back, and the Fusiliers' formation restricted their ability to return that fire. The Hildermouth Fusiliers were valiant men, but there is a limit to human endurance, and ultimately, as casualties inexorably mounted, the tipping point was reached, and the Hildermouth Fusiliers broke and ran. The Earl surveyed the battlefield and realised that all was lost. His army had been slaughtered and scattered to the four winds, and only the Westward Horse Guards remained to him. Under their escort, he fled the field. The first squadron of the Hildermead Hussars started in pursuit of the Earl. Queen Ophelia recalled them. She had won a crushing victory, but the Westward Horse Guards could still inflict damage upon her light cavalry, and there was no need to take unnecessary risks. The strategic military threat posed by the Earl of Westwood had been eliminated. Thus ended the Battle of the Meadham Road, the opening encounter of the War of the Noble Alliance.